Hello everybody and welcome back to another video lesson for 6th grade history. Today we are going to be finishing up our unit on the new nation. So we've been talking about what the United States looks like after the American Revolution, after we've broken away from Great Britain and created our own country. So we've talked about, first off, the Articles of Confederation, if you remember, was our first plan of government for the United States. We've talked about the Constitution, which is the replacement for the Articles of Confederation, because, of course, as we know, the Articles were very, very, very weak, too weak for them to be our official plan of government for the entire time that the United States of America exists. So we end up throwing those out and we write the Constitution. We've talked about how this sets up the powers of a new federal government, and it splits the power equally between the federal, the national government, and the state governments. That's the big thing that's different between the Constitution and the Articles. Then, of course, we talked about the document known as the Bill of Rights, which, of course, is a written guarantee of individual freedoms that are added to the Constitution when some states believed that the powers given to the national government were too much, and they were going to turn themselves into a monarchy, we say, which is a king or a queen. And that's something that Americans certainly did not want, and our founding fathers certainly did not want, especially because we just got rid of a monarchy with Great Britain. So we've gone through these documents, guys, and we have a plan of government. We have our branches of government set up, and we're going to focus in today on one branch in particular, the executive branch, which, as we've mentioned before under our Constitution notes, holds the office of the president. Now, if you've forgotten, the job of the president is to enforce the laws as well as command the armed forces. He is the commander-in-chief. And today's focus, ladies and gentlemen, is going to be the first 5 presidents of the United States. So why don't we just jump right into it? Our first president, gosh, I hope we know this, ladies and gentlemen, is George Washington. Of course, we've probably seen his picture on the quarter, on the dollar bill, probably in pictures and videos throughout our elementary school careers as well. It's a pretty well-known fact that George Washington is our first president of the United States. But what exactly happened while he was president? First off, guys, the federal court system is established. What does this mean? Pretty much, guys, this is talking about the hierarchy or the natural order of the court system. So you have things like local courts, which are going to be your town court, your village court, your city court. Then you're going to move up a level and you're going to have your county courts, right? You're going to have your counties, which has the towns and the cities and stuff inside of it. Then you're going to expand a little bit further. You'll have your state courts. Then you will have your federal courts that cover the entirety of the United States. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, the big granddaddy of them all up at the top, the Supreme Court. Remember, we talked about that. That's the judicial branch of our government system. And the Supreme Court is the highest order of the courts. Their say goes. Nobody can overturn their decision on a court case. George Washington also sees the Bill of Rights being added to the Constitution. So I know we've already covered the Bill of Rights, but technically, guys, George Washington becomes president before the Bill of Rights is written. So the Constitution is ratified, it is passed, the office of the president is created, so the founding fathers fill it with George Washington. It is then that they draft the Bill of Rights when, like I said, some states would not agree to ratify the Constitution without that extra guarantee of individual freedoms added there. We also see plans being made for the development of a national capital in Washington, D.C. So prior to D.C. being the location of our nation's capital, it was actually New York City. So George Washington would spend his presidency with New York City as the capital of the United States, but he chooses Washington, D.C. Because based on the amount of land that we had at the time, D.C. was the most centrally located area. No matter where it was right in the middle there. If you look at the original 13 states, you'll see D.C. is essentially smack dab in the middle of that line of states that run along the Atlantic coast. And he hires somebody that we're going to talk about at the end of this note sheet, a man named Benjamin Banneker, who is a surveyor and a construction worker. He hires him to plan Washington, D.C. He hires this African-American man, which at the time is unheard of, to plot the streets, the layout, how they were going to remove the land. He was a lot of the mastermind behind this and in creating D.C. as to what we know today. So that's what happened under George Washington's presidency. The next person we see is John Adams. John Adams, he's going to have some things that are unique to him, ladies and gentlemen. First off, he is from Massachusetts. He is the only one of the first 5 presidents that does not come from our state of Virginia, or our Commonwealth of Virginia. John Adams comes from Massachusetts. Under his administration, guys, a 2-party system emerges. This isn't going to be the same 2 political parties you see in 2021, being the Democrats and the Republicans. You're going to have Federalists and Anti-Federalists, essentially people that believe in a strong national government, and you're going to have people that believe in a strong state government. So those are really the 2 opposing viewpoints of politics during this time. And John Adams only ends up serving 1 term. So if you remember, guys, the office of the president is held for 4 years. That is considered a term. So 1 term is 4 years, 2 terms is 8 years, and no president can go past 8 years. There is 1 president that does, but you're going to talk about him next year in 7th grade when you go over the second half of U.S. history. Presidents can only serve for 2 terms. Washington served for 2. That was his cutoff point. John Adams ends up only serving for 1. He gets voted out at the end of his first term. The person that beats him is President number 3, Thomas Jefferson. We've talked about him a lot, ladies and gentlemen. Remember, he's the writer of the Declaration of Independence. He was the writer of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedoms. He was on the Constitutional Convention's board, helping to write the Constitution, putting his ideas forth, and helping create the plan of government for the United States. During his presidency, though, it's going to be focused on expanding the United States. One of the biggest things that Jefferson does is to buy the Louisiana Territory from France. This is the area of land that stretches from the Mississippi River about halfway through almost to the Rocky Mountains area, kind of ending in the Great Plains. I'll show you a picture of that in the video as well. But he buys this land, guys, for only $15 million from France because they really needed the money. 15 million might sound like a lot, but when you see how much land we actually got for $15 million, it's like 10 states worth of land, which is absolutely crazy, ladies and gentlemen. And now with this purchase of land, he does need people to go off and explore it and make maps of what this land looks like so that other explorers will be able to follow them and know where they're going. A person who makes maps, ladies and gentlemen, is called a cartographer. And the cartographers / explorers that Thomas Jefferson picked should actually be names that are very familiar to us: Lewis and Clark. Lewis and Clark explored new land west of the Mississippi. They were the ones that explored the Louisiana Territory, and they also go into a place called the Oregon Territory, but we're going to cover that particular area of land in our next unit when we talk about westward expansion. But Thomas Jefferson, guys, he hires Lewis and Clark to bring the 2 of them and their guide Sacagawea along for the journey and to plot out what the area of land looks like, to mark down the different species of animals and plants that they saw, and also to document the people that they met along their travels as well. Moving on then to our 4th president. Our 4th president is Mr. James Madison. He's kind of cool because he's the first president to declare war. So this is actually, we've moved past the 1780s, past actually the 1700s in general, and we are in the early 1800s with Mr. James Madison. He is going to be involved in the War of 1812, which caused European nations to gain respect for the United States. What's going on to cause the War of 1812? Well, Britain still owns Canada. The United States still own the United States, obviously. And are we friends? Not really. We kind of just beat them in the Revolution. And tensions are starting to rise again, and it does boil over into a conflict with the British called the War of 1812. This happened on American soil, and actually a lot of major cities were burned throughout the War of 1812, including Washington, D.C., and the Capitol building, almost the Capitol building, and the White House burned down as well during this time. Another little fun fact, doesn't really have anything to do with Virginia, but my hometown of Buffalo, New York, was actually burnt to the ground during the War of 1812 as well, because it is so close to Canada. It's right across the border there that it was one of the major conflict points of the War of 1812. So this war, of course, causes European nations to gain respect for the United States because, once again, we are showing that we are willing to stand up to the British and fight them, even though we are clearly the more inexperienced country with the least amount of, or with less money, with less resources to use. All right. Our fifth and final president, we do have one more person after him, though. Our fifth and final president is James Monroe. What do you need to know about him? He introduces something called the Monroe Doctrine. This warns European nations not to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. If you go all the way back to our geography unit, guys, remember we talked about what hemispheres are. The Western Hemisphere is everything to the west of the prime meridian. The Eastern Hemisphere is everything to the east of the prime meridian. Then, of course, you've got your Northern Hemisphere, which is north of the equator, and your Southern Hemisphere, which is south of the equator. Pretty much, guys, during James Monroe's presidency, he wanted to make sure that no European nations were traveling too far west into the American continents, either North America or South America. He told European countries, yo, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This is our territory now. And it does end up working for a while, and the colonization of countries in the Western Hemisphere slows considerably after the Monroe Doctrine is put into place. So, guys, those are our first 5 presidents. However, I did say we have one more person to go over. This person is not a president, but it is somebody we've already mentioned in this video, Mr. Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker is an interesting person because he gets lumped in with this unit because, like I said, he is hired by George Washington to survey and plan Washington, D.C. He was born a free African-American in Maryland, though. His mother was a free African-American. His father, though, was a fugitive slave, meaning that he was an escaped slave who was on the run from the law. He lived his life mostly as an astronomer, a writer, and a surveyor. An astronomer, guys, is somebody who studies the stars, studies constellations. I think we know what a writer is, and of course a surveyor is somebody who is going to measure land and plan what that land would, what kind of changes that land would need to undergo in order to build something on top of it. In this case, guys, he is going to survey the area of Washington, D.C. to build our nation's capital. Benjamin Banneker wrote almanacs that correctly gave times of eclipses and tides. So his attention to detail with the weather and with the stars allowed him to write books that predicted when certain things were going to happen. Like I said, eclipses where the moon passes in front of the sun, or tides like the low tide, high tide of the ocean or of lakes. He was able to predict that stuff using the scientific knowledge that he was studying. He had correspondence with Thomas Jefferson. That might not seem like a big deal, but for an African American during the late 1700s, early 1800s, that was a huge deal. Thomas Jefferson was a very important white figure, and Benjamin Banneker freely wrote letters back and forth with Thomas Jefferson and himself. The fact that Thomas Jefferson was willing to hear Benjamin Banneker's ideas showed that he respected him as a person a lot, and probably respected how smart of a person Benjamin Banneker was as well. So him and Thomas Jefferson had a lot of correspondence or a lot of talks together over letters. And then lastly, guys, I've said this like 3 times, but you need to make sure you have it in your notes. He was hired by George Washington to work on the surveying of Washington, D.C. I also think that Washington picked Banneker because Washington himself was a surveyor for many years. So I'm sure he knew the type of talent that it would take to create the nation's capital, and he knew that Benjamin Banneker would be the man for the job. All right. I know this was kind of a long video. We're closing in on 15 minutes here, but this is the end of our first 5 presidents' notes. As usual, please go back, check them over, make sure you have filled in every blank on the page, and when you are done, you can come back and rejoin us in the conference.